Hi, I'm Julia Yaffe, Senior Assistant Dean for External Affairs. Today we're doing a third of our series, our oral history in connection with our centennial. Today is September 6th, 2011, and we're beginning to be talking to former Dean and Professor Mack Player. So Mack.
Oh, hello.
Hello. As I said, this is part of a series that we're doing with the former deans of the law school to really capture the role you've played at the law school and a little bit more about who you are as a person. So I noticed going back in our history, trying to find out about our former deans, there was not much there. I mean, that in the future we'll take care of that. So I'd like to just start out with a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Springfield, Missouri. I went to high school there, went to college, undergraduate school there, and barely left town until I went to law school.
Wow.
That's where my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents all grew up. Deep roots in southern Missouri.
Southern Missouri. That's kind of not an unusual background for people in California, but that's quite a jump. So from Missouri, you went to the University of Missouri for
law
college?
School.
For law school, too?
I went to undergraduate school in Springfield, small liberal arts college called Drury College. Got a bachelor's in political science, of course, and then went to law school at the University of Missouri, where I had a very nice scholarship that my poor parents could not have afforded to send me to a school that didn't have a good scholarship. So my parents were very middle class at best working people. My father ran a gas station and later worked for the post office. My grandfather was a farmer, and my other grandfather was retired from running a small grocery store.
Then what led you to want to be a lawyer, to go to law school?
Well, my mother beat me into it.
that I don't believe.
I wasn't good in mathematics. I wanted to be an engineer first or an architect. Then I thought a little bit about medicine, but the thought of blood and even putting a needle in someone scared me to death. So I ended up by default thinking law. And my mother was a great influence on that. She said, if you don't know what you want to do, be a lawyer, because you can do anything. So my mother put a great deal of pressure on me to at least go to law school. So.
And did law school meet your expectation?
Oh, far exceeded it. It was my liberation. The first time in my life I was really forced to think. I loved law school. That's probably one of the reasons I ended up where I ended up, because I really liked law school. I hated to leave law school. I would have liked law school to have been 4 or 5 years. I just really thoroughly enjoyed it.
So what did you like so much about law school?
Just the intellectual challenge, the Socratic challenges that the professors gave, the interaction with the other students, the discussion, something that I never really had much of in undergraduate school. It was good, but this really was, and I just loved the concepts of the law, and justice, and constitutional theory, and all those things that law school kind of opened my eyes to. So.
As you were planning your career while you were in law school, how did you think you would use your legal education?
Had no idea. For 2 summers, I clerked in the summers with a sole practitioner, a very prominent sole practitioner in my hometown. A delightful man, later become a judge. But I just couldn't see myself coming back to a fairly small town practice of searching for wills and writing wills and searching titles and doing slip and fall and dog bite cases. I just didn't see like that's what I wanted to do. And in my 3rd year of law school, I was working part-time in the law library. The dean of the law school was kind of happening through one day, and he said, Mr. Player, do you have a job yet? And it was about January of my graduating year, and I said, no, sir, I don't. And he said, how would you like to be a clerk for a federal judge? And I had to ask him, what was that? And after he explained it to me, I thought, that sounds good. That sounds interesting. And so at that time, the dean just told the federal judge who he recommended. So the dean wrote a letter to Judge Gibson, whom I clerked for, and my interview consisted of showing up to Judge Gibson's chambers. He looked at me and asked me if I could type. The only thing he asked me about, he said, can you type? Because I don't read my law clerk's handwritten, and I could type. My mother insisted, by the way, that I learn how to type. This was well before the age of computers. So he said, well, the dean thinks highly of you, when can you start? And I was out in 5 minutes. So I clerked for 2 years for a federal judge, still not knowing what I wanted to do, because that was part of the thing. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I interviewed at some law firms in Kansas City, Chicago, St. Louis, because once you clerk for a federal judge, you have a certain entree, so to speak. And I didn't like the notion of working in a large firm either. The lawyers there were kind of back in the stacks, doing research on more monetarily important but equally mundane things. They were just multiple dog bites as opposed to one dog bite. So I didn't want to do that either. And I just didn't know what I wanted to do. And I spent 2 years clerking for Judge Gibson. He was on the U.S. Court of Appeals at this time, the 8th Circuit in Kansas City. And so I was about to be drafted into the Vietnam War. And one exemption from being drafted was an academic position. So I decided to apply for an academic position and hoping to get one so I wouldn't be drafted into the Vietnam War. I had no notion that I wanted to be an academic other than I didn't want to be slogging through the jungles of Vietnam, at the age of 26 or 27. So I've got an appointment at the University of Georgia, having no notion that I would like teaching or enjoy an academic life at all. So that's the story of my life.
Wow. And what was your first area of scholarship then when they hired you?
Well, when I was hired, you taught what the dean or the school said was needed. And since, as a clerk for a federal judge, I'd done a lot of criminal procedure, constitutional criminal procedure, search and seizure cases, arrests, and so forth, and worked on a number of fairly major criminal law, criminal procedure. So that's what I began teaching, criminal law, criminal procedure. But you had to teach other things, so I think I taught my first 3 years of teaching, I taught half the curriculum. Family law, evidence, I ended up in property, which I got drafted into. So I taught a wide range of things, but in those days, back in the late 60s, early 70s, you taught what the law school was needed, particularly if you just came. I'd been out of law school 2 plus years when I started teaching, so I was younger than many of the students, particularly the returning Vietnam veterans. I was much younger than they were. And so junior professors taught kind of what the school needed, and that's what I taught for quite a while. I enjoyed labor law very much when I was clerking for Judge Gibson, because a good percentage of the cases before the Court of Appeals were labor cases. The enforcement orders from the National Labor Relations Board go directly to the Court of Appeals, and so a lot of the work was in labor. I had never had a course in labor law in law school. And Judge Gibson, who had been a federal district judge, did not know much about labor law. So we learned it together, and I found it just fascinating. So I decided once I got a bit of seniority at the University of Georgia, where I was teaching, that I would try to switch into labor law. So after 3 years of kind of trudging in the vineyards of teaching what they wanted me to teach, I went to Washington and got a position with the solicitor's office in the Department of Labor, and did an LLM in labor law at George Washington. And then when my 2 years was completed in Washington, I came back to the University of Georgia and began teaching employment and labor classes, as well as a couple of other things. But I got into labor law having never taken a course in my basic JD, but I took a whole string of courses at GW in labor law, and some very excellent national known experts on labor law, and written the books that I used later and so forth. So that was, and I had some experience, practicing at the appellate level, doing labor cases with the Department of Labor.
And did you start writing in the area while you were at Georgia? Or?
Yes, I'd written a couple of pieces, not on labor, when I was an assistant professor. I forget what they were on, property or remedies or something. And then I began, when I came back from my 2 years in Washington, and came back to the faculty with tenure at this point. I had enough seniority and was able to get some research time. I began writing in employment and labor law. And employment discrimination was not really a course yet, which I really ended up focusing on. It was a very fringe. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was just now getting, by 1970, 72, was the first Supreme Court cases were coming down in 70, 71, 72. So I kind of put together a seminar on employment discrimination, just a kind of a 2-unit spin-off from labor law, which I taught for a number of years, and then wrote a nutshell, and I think it was 75, 76, first nutshell on employment discrimination. And then 78 and 79, I did a casebook with West, the first one on the topic of employment discrimination. And then about 3 years later, it was enough of a subject now that it got to be a a section of the American Association of Law Schools, or the Association of American Law Schools. And I was the first president of the section of the employment discrimination section of the AALS. And by this time I was doing a lot of publishing and speaking and stuff in labor employment law. By this time almost always employment discrimination, age discrimination, sex discrimination, and so forth. So I did that from then to the mid-'80s at the University of Georgia.
And then from Georgia, you moved on to Florida State?
Not quite. I was given a chaired position at the University of Georgia. And two of them, actually I had one more minor one, then I was named Regents Professor at the University of Georgia, which was a university. The university had two of them. I had one, and the person in the physics department had the other one. And the only significance of that is we got to march at the front of the academic procession and carry a stick of some sort. But we were Regents Professors. And soon thereafter, I got an appointment to the Department of Justice as a scholar in residence. And so I went to the Department of Justice in Washington and did appellate work with the Civil Division in Washington. And then at that point, I moved from there to Florida State. I got an offer I couldn't refuse from Florida State. So I went from Georgia, took a year's leave of absence, went to Washington, the U.S. Department of Justice. After a year and summer of there, then I went to Florida State, and where I stayed and there I taught almost exclusively labor. But I was associate dean for a year, and I was also director of an institute for dispute resolution, project of the Florida Supreme Court, dealing with training of mediators and arbitrators. So that's where I was when I came here.
What made you decide to throw your hat in the ring to become a dean?
Well, I had been toying with the idea of being a dean for some time because I saw how bad so many deans were. I thought I could do better. And I think at anything, I've been teaching at this point for 20 years or more. I was kind of looking for something different. I enjoyed my administrative experience that I'd had. And the dean, then dean and still dean of Florida State Law School, thought I would be a great dean for whatever reason. He kept sending letters to various dean search committees. And I went on a couple of interviews to places I didn't really want to go to, and they probably weren't interested in me anyway. And then I get this letter from Santa Clara. And one of the alums of Santa Clara was on the faculty at Florida State, had been George Alexander's research assistant while she was a Santa Clara student. So I talked about what Santa Clara was like, talked about George and other things. And so this sounded interesting. And my wife, Jean, had lived in California, in the Bay Area, for a number of years before we were married. And she thought moving to California might be interesting. So it all kind of seemed to fit. So I came out for an interview. And I liked the place, the people, loved California. And they apparently liked me well enough to take a roll of the dice, so I got hired. But I'd not been a dean before. This was my first adventure. But I'd been around a long time. I'd been on virtually every committee a law school could come up with. And I'd been an associate dean. I directed institutes and various things. So I had some administrative experience, but not as a dean.
What was your first impression of Santa Clara when you got here? I mean, you had your experience at Georgia and at Florida State.
Well, it was a very, very different law school than I've been in. All of my experiences had been with state law schools, and a part of a huge university, University of Missouri. I visited at the University of Hawaii. I had taught for years at the University of Georgia, Florida State, all large state institutions. So here I come to a relatively small undergraduate school, and it was in private Jesuit. It was an experience that I'd not had. But it was very refreshing because the one thing I really worried about as dean was dealing with state bureaucracy, dealing with state legislators and governors and stuff. And particularly in Florida State and Georgia, the governors of the state would get involved in law school issues, and I just really didn't want to do that. I probably would have done it at the right school, but that was very refreshing. I wasn't going to have to deal with that. I liked very much and just immediately really admired and personally liked both Paul Locatelli, who was president, and Steve Prevett, who was the provost or vice president for academic affairs. I thought these are really two people I could really work with. I liked them very much, both of them. I had the highest degree of respect for both of them. So that was good. I liked the faculty, but it had no different, it had its quirks and its idiosyncrasies, but that was similar to other faculties that I dealt with. And it had a lot of challenges that were appealing to me, but were not faculty schisms. The faculty was not killing each other, and I was called in to sort it all out. Couple of schools I interviewed, the whole thing was the first thing you need to do as dean is fire the librarian, fire these 3 faculty members, and keep us from disintegrating. I didn't want to get involved either in faculty fights. So this was a very tranquil and very forgiving faculty. So that was appealing. And there were a lot of challenges, though, that I thought would be fun to tackle. It wasn't just keeping the boat from sinking in the sense of the sitting here. It was really, we've got some things that Santa Clara has some things that need to be done, and I think I can be helpful in doing that. So it all fit together, and my wife liked California, Jean liked California. Had been here many times before. I liked it, so we said we were happy in Florida. I mean, we were really basically well settled and had a good lifestyle. My wife was the administrative judge for the state of Florida, and I was doing what I enjoyed doing very much, half administration, half teaching, quite a bit of scholarship. I was a good lifestyle. And so we had to think, this is a gamble. We both like what we're doing a lot, and we like where we are, but we kind of took the plunge. I must say it wasn't for the money. And my wife is not a member of the California bar. She didn't have a job, so she was giving up a job she really liked. She was a member of the Florida bar, so things got tough. She could practice law. And so she feared having to take the California bar. But luckily she got a job as a federal administrative judge soon after we arrived, so it all worked out. It fit perfectly. So happiest 9 years of my life.
So when you came and settled in as dean, what was your vision? What was your agenda? What were the things that you wanted to?
Well, you were there most of the time, Julia, so, and you probably could correct me or second what I have to say. But as you know, in 1994, so I arrived in the summer of '93. It was fairly apparent after just looking very closely that nationally the applicant pool was drying up. It wasn't going away, but there was just a demographic decline in the number of undergraduates, and that was going to be in the works for 3, 4 to 6 years. And similarly, there was a dry up of LSAT applications and taking, so we knew nationally the applicant pool was going to be drying up. That pond was going to get even smaller. And that was apparent. I mean, I knew that before I arrived, or if I didn't, you or someone that knew more about it than I did informed me that that was a problem. And so the school faced this kind of dual challenge. That is, on one hand, if our applications fall at the national level, follow the same trend, the school's either going to have to cut enrollment to maintain academic quality in terms of student credentials, or in which, if we cut enrollment financially, it would have been just extremely difficult. We'd have had to lay off people or freeze salaries and cut back programs that were already in existence. It would have been very difficult to cut enrollment. But at the same time, if we saw our academic credentials of our entering class, then we faced repercussions from that, because the status of the school at that time, as you probably remember, was we were having very struggling bar results. Our placement record was not particularly sterling, and we were ranked nationally among these poll systems, which I don't like, but students were increasingly using U.S. News and these other things to select law schools, for better or for evil, that we couldn't see ourselves continuing to go down. So that the timing of the national demographics couldn't have been worse for Santa Clara. So we had to figure out a way, even though we knew applications were going to drop, how we keep the quality of the academic credentials consistent or perhaps even improving, and make sure that we don't have any decreases in enrollment, and provide maybe some other sources of income, such as graduate programs, summer programs, and so forth. And then, as you recall too, our facilities were just absolutely atrocious. And I knew that when I interviewed. I'd never seen a law school, and I'd been on any number of ABA, American Bar Association, inspection teams. I'd never seen a law school that had as shabby facilities and so cramped for office space. And we know that's the thing. The students that are looking at schools, they don't want to come to a 19th century schoolhouse with a pot-bellied stove in the back of the room. They want modern classrooms. If we're going to hire faculty to teach enriching courses, more, we have to have offices and we have to have classrooms. So getting the facilities in line as quickly as was possible was the first challenge, it seemed to me. And very early on, you and Jeanette, working with you, really undertook an aggressive student recruiting efforts. We did a lot of innovative things that were not headlines today, but really creative ways of recruiting students, interviewing them. Increased dramatically the scholarships, allocated much more money than we'd had in the past to scholarships, established the Dean's Fellows program to try to give full scholarships to the very brightest students. So financial aid, vigorous recruiting, and then get the facilities in place so we have top of the line classrooms, more seminar and classrooms so we can hire faculty. So that was kind of the first step, and that was kind of 94, 95, 96. So that was kind of first step. And then, of course, once we get the facilities, then we have to have faculty to teach in them.
Right.
Fill the offices and the classrooms. So that was early years. I thought, getting that immediate challenge. And we were successful, as you know. Although applications dropped, the quality of numerical indicators remained at least constant and began actually to go up over the next 4 years. When the many schools, they were going down, ours were going up. And it was largely you and other people vigorously recruiting and scholarship money that we had available, and kind of an increased feeling that the school was not dropping dead, but was. And then of course, through the faculty meetings and so forth, we had other strategies that were more long range, like focusing on the three strengths of the school: intellectual property, social justice, and international law, and hoping to build a greater reputation there to open up niche markets. So even though our overall U.S. news ratings were far from spectacular, that we would appeal to people wanting to get the best, nation's best, in at least three areas: international law, intellectual property, and social justice. With the greatest possibility being, I thought at the time, and I think the faculty agreed, was intellectual property. Here's where we could really move the school to the top and attract from our natural constituency some of the best students looking for intellectual property. And as you know, by 1998, I think it was, we had the second-ranked intellectual property program in the country. We were above Stanford, above Harvard. So that was part of this. Let's attract a certain market as opposed to something for everybody. And I think it worked. I think we had increasing numbers of people that were coming to Santa Clara for their international programs, social justice, and intellectual property. And I think the surveys that you often did confirmed that we were getting that share of those specific people.
And that was a new concept. I think for the past, or since then, we've kind of taken it for granted that we have those three specializations. But that wasn't a given understanding. Obviously, we'd had social justice, public interest before then. We'd had a little bit with Howard Annawalt, the high tech.
There'd been some, but yes, there'd been some kind of things. We had the International Law Institute, but it was George Alexander, basically. And it was primarily summer abroad programs. And we didn't really have a senior international law. Well, we did, but she left. So when I arrived, the year after I arrived, we had no senior professor of international law. We had no nationally known scholar of social justice publications. And we had no one that could teach patent law on our faculty. We had to use adjuncts. I mean, they did a good job, but they were local practitioners. So the first thing was, how can we get really building on the little blocks that we had in place, really building a structure for intellectual property. So, setting up an institute for it's like we had in intellectual property, establishing a certificate program for not only international intellectual property, but for intellectual property, starting LLM programs in international law, U.S. law for foreign students, and intellectual property. That's also financial, because LLM students allow you to increase enrollment, which means more revenue, but also adds to the reputation of the school. So those were part of the strategies that the faculty endorsed and largely instrumental, and we were able to hire into those specialties. We were looking for intellectual property. We found Don Chisholm, the internationally known top man in patent law, who came to Santa Clara. We got national press for that. We hired A couple of years later, Stephanie Wildman, probably the most well-known public service social justice professor and winner of national Best Teacher awards. We hired Ursi Toman from Geneva, at the Dunant Institute, to be our senior international law professor. And then we throw in some other very good people like David Friedman and other young people that really increased the focus and our ability to focus. But now we had offices to put them in and classrooms for them to teach, and now we could really dramatically expand our course offerings, because now we had professors who could teach these courses. So we became one of the richest curricular offerings of most American law schools our size. I mean, we're extremely rich, and particularly in intellectual property. I don't think any school in the country matched the number of courses and offerings at the advanced level of intellectual property that Santa Clara did. So that was part of the strategic plan that went back to the summer of, I think it was summer of 1994, my second summer here. Had a faculty retreat in which we sat down, and I remember before PowerPoint putting up slides and showing the various charts of the declining applicant pool and outline strategies on how to deal with this, at least the best I could figure out how to do it in my 1 year thinking about it. And the faculty got behind it 99, if not 100%. They were willing to see that some of their favorite projects and programs were not giving the funding and the manpower that they would like, but nonetheless saw the need for the school to pursue that niche specialty strategies. And it worked. By the time 98, as I said, our national rankings with the U.S. News had been going up every year. I think by 2003, when I left, we were up about 65th or 69th in the country, coming from way down. I don't remember the exact numbers, but we had really moved the school, at least in terms of those irrelevant but important things.
Yeah.
And we retained our diversity. That was another threat, because what happens if we have to really start losing our what Dean Ullman before me had established as a very strong presence in diversity. And we retained that. By the 90s, we still were number 2, calculated number 2nd in the country in terms of diversity of our student body. Not that that was different from before, but they began calculating it in the mid-90s. And so we knew now that we really could say we have the 2nd most diverse law school in the country. And we did that in a time of declining applicant pool. So that was something the school really, and I just thought it was absolutely the most fascinating challenge to take on. I just enjoyed every moment of the challenge.
Okay. Let me go back just a little bit. In terms of the faculty you hired and so on, it seems like you put more emphasis on scholarship as a criteria in hiring faculty than in the past. Would that be fair to say?
I wouldn't want to compare it to the
past.
past.
No, not compared, but it
yes,
really a renewed emphasis.
My strategy, which the faculty accepted, was that we would balance. We were going to add new positions because we had to improve student-faculty ratios. We were one of the lowest in the country. We needed to get it up at least to the national average, if not better. Not we did, but that meant hiring faculty. And the strategy that the faculty accepted from me was that we would basically hire 1 senior for every junior. We wouldn't go into the cheap market totally, but we wanted to keep young, vibrant people. We didn't want to just be just an elephant's graveyard. So we did. If you could look at the hiring we did, we hired at both levels. Emerging young scholars like Brad Jundep and Beth Van Schok, and balance those against Don Chisholm, Ursi Toman, David Friedman, and some others that are no longer here. But we really did try to balance the new additions, accretions to our faculty. And luckily we didn't lose very many people during this period. We weren't replacing people because we kept faculty salaries reasonably good, actually increasing. So the people were reasonably happy here. And then we were able then in our hires not to just replace people that were going out the door. We were able to actually use our hiring to increase the size of the faculty pretty dramatically. That's always the trouble with law schools, because you can only really effectively interview and hire 3, maybe 4 people a year, max. Okay. And if you're losing 4 people a year, all you're doing is just replacing retirees. So you had to keep your good faculty, and they were good faculty, here, and then add 3, 4 a year, or 2 or 3 a year, to build not only strength but numbers. and which we were able to do, which the school was able to do.
You started to say before that these were some of the, or were the happiest 9 years of your life. What did you like so much about directing, orchestrating things like putting up faculty in place?
It was the challenge of it was challenge of dealing with the constituencies which were manageable. I didn't have to deal with a state. I had to deal with the university, but as I indicated earlier, I got along, from my perspective, marvelously with the president and the provost, Steve Purvett and Paul Locatelli. They gave me a lot of leeway, and they were willing to accept an awful lot of my. And the university just did not get in the way or slow things down or give us bureaucracy problems at all. I enjoyed the staff that was in place here, and the ones that came a few years later, like you. I just thought that this is great, because that's often a problem with schools. They've got some senior staff people that are either vaguely incompetent or some other problem with them. But for the most part, the people that were here I was impressed with, and for the most part, you and later Susan Irwin and stuff just did magnificent work. Made my life very easy, because you and Kathy Turan just did an excellent job of the day-to-day administration of the school. And dealing with the faculty was generally a pleasure. They were supportive for the most part. And we had our disagreements and spats, and there would be the usual complainer. But for the most part, they were very supportive, and no, I wasn't trying to keep my job. A lot of deans spend most of their time worrying about the faculty rebellions that are going to toss them out. I had no problems with that. As far as I know, there was no rebellion going on. Dissent, yes. I didn't get everything I wanted through the faculty, but nonetheless, it was generally polite and non-confrontational. So it was a pleasure in starting to meet and deal with the alumni, who had kind of been left out, I think, in some years past. Dealing with them, they were delightful people, and enjoyed working with them, trying to begin building the school's development. We had virtually no fundraising capacity for reasons no one's fault in the past. It was because of the relationship with the university before the Memorandum of Understanding, which Dean Ullman was able to secure. For the first time, we had fundraising capacity, but we didn't have any fundraisers. And we had very small alumni giving base. We just didn't know who was out there. But getting to know those people and getting that kind of started, I found very challenging. I'm not a very good fundraiser. I always had difficulty asking for money. And I wasn't a particularly good public speaker and fellow well met. But I did enjoy meeting them and working on the structure that the future fundraising could be built on. And actually doing some fundraising. We did get 2 chairs during the period I was dean, and endowed a goodly number of the scholarships that we enjoyed.
Which chairs were those?
Those were the Sutro chair, which was fairly early. It started actually soon after I got here as dean. Mrs. Sutro and her grandson, who was a graduate of the school, contacted me about an interest in some kind of gift to commemorate the husband and grandfather, who was not a Santa Clara graduate but had been on the Board of Visitors, Jack Sutro. So I began meeting with the Sutro family probably as early as '94, with this notion that she would like to do something for her recently deceased husband, and the son was Jack Jr., who was a judge in Marin County, and the grandson who went to law school here and was Jerry Ullman's research assistant. So I began meeting with them and discussing various possibilities, scholarships, institutes, whatever their interest was. And Mrs. Sutro and her family began making generous contributions that allowed that chair to be established. And family decided that they would like an endowed professorship, which reached the point of being endowed. The first recipient was George Alexander, the previous dean. And then the second chair was the Inez Mabee chair, which Ron Malone, who was a trustee for an estate, Ron was an alum of the school. I'm not sure how the contacts began, but on outreach we contacted Ron, and he said, well, he didn't have a lot of money himself, but he did have, as a trustee, could allocate a lot of charitable allocations. So we began talking about a chaired professorship, which he, through his efforts, Inez Mabee was deceased at that stage, the second chair, and that was awarded to Don Chisholm. He already was here and had a university, very nominal university chair, but when we got the Mabee chair because the president knew I was working on getting another chair for Don, and allocated the San Filippo chair to the law school to keep our superstar happy.
Right. What are some of the other things that, accomplishments, things that stand out as changes or steps forward that were made while you were dean?
Well, of course, the physical plant was just always a challenge, and I liked it because I enjoyed, as I said, I kind of wanted to be an architect when I was young, and I liked art and architect, so it gave me an opportunity to put on my hard hat and more semi-supervise the total renovation of the ground floor abandoned. As you recall, we had to do that in the summer. I mean, the day classes were over, because it had to be, we moved everything out, just gutted the place, and we had to be back in mid-August when classes started. So that was, I had a lot of sleepless nights. Are we going to have classrooms, when we start up? And then the next year we went and did Bergen Hall and the connector, and put in many more offices. And this required some moving deck chairs around. We had to put some people out in a house on Lafayette Street, a kind of old two-storied house. And then we put the law reviews, moved them out of where the student lounge now is, into a house on the edge of campus, on the other end of the campus. So kind of moving all those deck chairs around was, I found, enchanting. And then I just did not like bare walls and buildings, so I kind of put myself together a little art fund and began buying some, make the place cheerful and interesting and attentive to, attractive to faculty, and make them proud of where they're working. And I remember Kathy Tron, one of the senior associate deans when I retired, gave me his funniest cartoon. She was the head of accounting, as you know, Kathy was, in the business aspects of the school. Funniest cartoon has all this awful art in some reception room, and then the commentators are saying, yes, but their accounting principles are impeccable. So Kathy was in charge of accounting, and I was in charge of buying art. But so I enjoyed that. I found was intriguing, and a lot of the faculty, most of the faculty at the time, liked the idea and liked it. Some of them disagreed with the selections that were made, but most of them said, well, I wouldn't pick that, but I do really like that one, and you can't please everyone. So anyway, that was, and dealing with the people, dealing with the challenges. Every day was you came to the office and there was something to deal with, a lot of small fires that all deans have to do, an angry student group, and constant fussing from the alumni about the bar passage rates. Are they getting better? What are you doing, Dean? I kind of feel like poor President Obama, every failure is the president's. Well, when the students fail the bar, it's the dean's fault, so.
I'm sure they were pleased when we got the order of Coif.
Well, yes, that was kind of in the works, because the school had wanted to do that many years back, long before I came. But the Order of the Coif is very selective. You really have to have they focus on faculty scholarship, and so you have to have a very productive faculty scholarship. They focus on things like student-faculty ratios. They focus on facilities, quality of the library, all these kind of things that we finally, by about 2001, it seemed to me that looking at the Coif requirements that we could do it. So I contacted the hierarchy of the Order of the Coif and formalized an application, all the reams of things you have to fill out, finances, student qualities, and so forth. And then they send an inspection team, which looked at us just like an ABA inspection. And so in 2003, kind of about 6 months before I left, we were elected to the Order of the Coif, which is really an honor because there are about 80 law schools that are, at that time, maybe slightly fewer. I think there are 80 now. It really is something that you have, it's a benchmark that shows you are a good law school. Not like U.S. News and World Report kind of rankings of things that people don't know anything. These are our peers that come in and say this is a good law school, and to have that kind of stamp of approval means that we finally had accomplished something that we couldn't have accomplished 10 years ago, 10 years before. And so that was kind of a capstone of really saying, okay, and we can tell applicants now that this school is a member of the Order of the Coif. It's like Phi Beta Kappa for undergraduate. It tells the applicant in the world, this is a good law school. And so that was very significant, and it was something that I thought was important for the law school, that milestone. U.S. News, that's junk. You have to pay attention to it because students, applicants do, and they get upset when it drops and they go to other schools and so forth. But Order of the Coif was something it's not just popularity contest. It's something that you've been peer evaluated, and much more stringent than ABA accrediting. I mean, it's the next level. You're ABA accredited one level. That's very minimal. A lot of law schools are ABA accredited and not very good. Then a membership in the Association of American Law Schools. That's kind of the next level. They're a little bit more selective. You have to have a certain scholarship levels and so forth from your faculty. The Ordre de Coif is another generational gap. So that was, and it's not that I did it. The school had just progressed to the point that we not only overcame a challenge that would potentially put us in a downward spiral that's difficult to pull out from, that we had reached the level that we could be admitted to a very prestigious honor society.
During your deanship, which was
9 years.
9 years, about double, at least maybe triple the national average longevity for deans at that time, I think. You had a lot of accomplishments, but then you decided to move on.
Well, they make the President of the United States quit after 8 years, and I had told the President, Locatelli, that that was my limit, 8 years. And I set that for myself, and I'm going to be 62 or something, 63 then, something like that. And I thought, it's really time I want to retire. And notwithstanding the fact I really loved it, I was getting tired. It's just that it's like being a law student again. You never leave it. You can't go on vacation. My summers were spent going to foreign programs while ABA inspectors were there. There were always issues. We were building something or buying something, and you're on the phone or the email or something all the time. And I was just wearing out, and I was really just ready to do. And the president, Paul Locatelli, said, "Well, why don't you take a year sabbatical and just take off for a year and come back?" And I thought about that for a while and just said, I just don't think that's what I want to do, and I just don't think it's fair to the school to kind of leave them in limbo for a year, and I come back for at most 2 or 3 years, maybe. Let's just cut it clean. So I just kind of, I love doing it, but at the end of 8 years, I said, I'll give you one more year, and I just just didn't start any new initiatives, really. The Ordre de Coif was kind of there. East San Jose was moving to new facilities, but I was going to leave new initiatives to my successor. And one of the things that I also thought was important, we've been focusing on high tech a lot, but was that the evolution of the East San Jose Community Law Center. It was started before I was dean, under Dean Ullman's tenure, as a volunteer organization. It was kind of, Eric and Nancy Wright, Professors Wright, and then Professor Jim Hammer were very instrumental in kind of organizing, getting it started, getting a lot of La Raza students, primarily Hispanic students, kind of involved as volunteers. And they got some very tacky but usable facilities along in the spring of 2003, right before I arrived. Because I remember going out and kind of supervising the painting and the furniture moving in the summer of 93. Well, that evolved over a period of time from just being a volunteer student organization, kind of hit and miss, to getting a full-time director, to beginning gradually law school funding, and then the increasing staff there, doing various specialties that the centers worked on. We moved them into being an integral part of the law school. It became the law school's clinical program. And now all the staff there were moved from being employees of this nonprofit organization to being faculty of the law school, clinical faculty. And a good portion of the center's resources now were coming from the law school. So that, and then in 93, I think it was the spring of 93, they moved from East San Jose to the current location on the Alameda in the new, much expanded facilities, and became now clearly the law school's, very close to the campus, law school's clinical program. So I viewed that as both interesting and challenging, because there was all kinds of political tensions with the Hispanic community in East San Jose, with faculty's division as to whether or not this should remain in private or whether it should be brought within the law school. I think there were probably some dissensions among the people at East San Jose itself as to whether or not they wanted to be kind of under the thumb of the law school, but at the same time having the job security and the semi-prestige of being a faculty member at the school. So working that through, which was very political, I found I didn't dislike it. I enjoyed it. I thought sorting this out and trying to accommodate each of these people's interests was something that I had done back in the days when I was training mediators, my prior life. It was something I enjoyed doing. It was really, people would yell at me, but I didn't find it. It didn't make me angry. It just kind of said, that's just the way it is. That's part of the process, and so I really enjoyed it. And so I thought that was a fairly significant step, but it was very gradual. It was evolving kind of from 93 to over 10 years, about 10 years, from kind of 93 to 2003. I didn't start the whole process, and at the early years I had very little involvement because it was a private organization. It was like the Red Cross or something. Students went down and volunteered, but the law school had very little relationship, to the point that it became the school's clinical program. And we basically dissolved the old law clinic, and it became merged in with the...
Yeah, another area that continued to evolve were international programs, and once you stepped down from the deanship, you became director of those programs. So
there was a 2-year hiatus there, but George Alexander remained director until
while you were on sabbatical.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, 2 were started when I was dean. One, the program in Seoul was started. I didn't have much to do with it in I think the summer of 2004. It had been a little satellite program off of Tokyo, and now it evolved. But that was George and Phil Jimenez.
In 1994.
Yeah, excuse me, 1994. I got my decades mixed up. And another one was established in Munich. Don Chisholm, a summer institute in comparative international law in Munich. So 2 were started when I was dean. But those were largely the efforts, of George Alexander. I was dean at the time and lent my moral support and the financial arrangements necessary and the ABA accrediting that was necessary. I basically worked through. But they were there when I was dean, but I wasn't really part of anything I really did. I encouraged Don Chisholm, I think, to take it on. I thought it would be a good idea, and he had a lot of friends there, so he agreed to do it. So I kind of worked with Don about getting that done. But then after then I became director of the newly formed global, we changed the name after George retired from the Institute of International Law to the Center for Global Law and Policy. Some structural changes, as with any new administration, but largely a name. We had too many institutes, want to get something a little different. And Elizabeth Powers was kind of my co-director, so to speak. She was full-time administrator of the program. I did foreign relations, and she did domestic programs. So all the domestic conferences, the refugee conference that International Red Cross put on here, and speakers, events, and so forth, Elizabeth did almost exclusively. And I focused on getting semester exchange agreements with other universities, foreign universities, and summer abroad programs, both revising some of the old ones and changing their format, and starting, I think, 3 or 4 new ones. So I spent 3 years involved in that, and I enjoyed that too. That was a lot of fun. But the travel finally wore me out. I was getting too old to stand in lines at the airport anymore, so I was going all over the world, which in some ways was a dream job if you like traveling. And I thought I would think, this is great. It's a job I thought I was going to get when I was in law school. I wanted to be an international lawyer at one stage, and here I was, going to Istanbul and India and Tokyo and all these places and working with foreign academics and setting up these exchange and summer abroad programs. Really enjoyed it, but 3 years was enough. I was ready to retire.
Well, that kind of brings us up to the present. What are your plans now?
Well, technically I'm retired. I had a phased retirement which ended this past summer in August. Technically I'm a professor, Dean Emeritus. The Dean Polden, allowed me to hang around and make a nuisance of myself for another year. Largely because my wife can't retire until a year from now, next September. I'm teaching for the 4th time. I'm teaching this starting next week in Switzerland. I've been teaching in Switzerland. This is my 4th junket there. Of course, in U.S. law, introduction to U.S. law for Swiss law students. I've been teaching in the summer programs, both abroad and here. We have a U.S. law for foreign students for our LLM program. I've been teaching in that, and I may or may not do it next year, but I did it this summer. I'll be teaching 1 class in the spring, one final class, and then I'll be fully retired. And I don't collect stamps, play tennis, golf, or anything exciting, so I've got to sit and read, I guess. My wife has no idea what we're going to do with ourselves. But we're going to spend about half the year in Florida, the winters, and the other half in San Francisco, where we